The jungle closes in, the mud is ankle deep, and the rifle in your hands, 9.5 pounds of walnut and steel, is the only thing standing between you and a banzai charge in the dark. You press the trigger, once, twice, 6 times. Then you hear it, that sharp, ringing ping as the empty clip rockets out of the receiver and vanishes into the undergrowth. 8 rounds. Gone. And somewhere in the darkness, your enemy knows it too. For 8 decades, that sound has followed the M1 Garand like a legend, half myth, half truth, echoing through the history of American arms. And right alongside it, a question that never fully went away. Why, in a war where submachine guns held 30 rounds and the BAR carried 20, did the most powerful nation on earth issue its soldiers a rifle that could only hold 8? The answer isn't simple, it isn't stupid, and it has almost nothing to do with John Garand. If you want to understand how a nation chooses its weapons, not just the engineering, but the fear, the politics, the bureaucracy, and the hard-earned logic of men who had watched armies die in mud, then stay with us. Because before you can understand the Garand's en bloc clip, you have to understand the world that made it. If this kind of deep dive military history is what you come here for, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. We do this every week. John Canius Garand was not an army man. He was born in Quebec in 1888, raised in New England, and was, by any measure, a mechanical genius without formal training. He arrived at Springfield Armory in 1919 as a civilian gun designer, hired to solve one of the Army's most persistent problems, replacing the bolt-action M1903 Springfield with something a soldier could fire faster without sacrificing accuracy. What's crucial to understand, and what most people get wrong, is that Garand's first instinct was exactly what you'd expect from a clear-eyed engineer. His earliest prototypes, including the T1919 model, fed from a detachable box magazine. He saw no reason it shouldn't work. The Browning automatic rifle, already in service, carried a 20-round detachable box magazine and functioned beautifully. Why wouldn't you do the same? The answer came from John Pedersen. Pedersen was another Springfield Armory designer working on a competing semi-automatic rifle design in the early 1920s. He had developed his own vision for how a military rifle should feed, using what he called an en-bloc clip, a U-shaped piece of spring steel that held rounds together as a single unit, loaded directly into a fixed internal magazine. Pedersen lobbied the Ordnance Department hard. He made the case that this was a more reliable, more rugged, and more soldier-proof system than any detachable box magazine could be. The Ordnance Department listened, and when Garand transitioned from his original primer-actuated mechanism to a gas-operated system, a fundamental redesign of how the rifle functioned, the department didn't give him a choice. The new Garand rifle would use an en-bloc clip, internal magazine, non-protruding, sealed receiver. That was the mandate. Garand knew the die was cast. He built the best en-bloc system anyone had ever seen. But why? Why was the Ordnance Department so determined to keep that magazine inside the rifle? To answer that, you have to think like a senior Army officer in 1930, not 2024, with 50 years of assault rifle experience behind you. 1930. The last major war was fought in trenches. Mud wasn't a metaphor. It was the dominant tactical reality of modern combat. Men had watched rifles jam, seize, and fail in conditions that defied imagination. A grain of sand in the wrong place wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. And from that perspective, the concerns about a detachable box magazine were not irrational. They were, in fact, carefully considered. The first concern was loss. A soldier in the heat of battle, scared, exhausted, under fire, drops things. He always has. The British Army had faced this exact criticism with the Lee Enfield's detachable magazine decades earlier. The fear was that an infantryman, ripping out an empty magazine under fire, would hurl it into the mud and never see it again. Lose the magazine, lose the rifle. A Lee Enfield without its magazine is a single-shot weapon. An M1903 Springfield without its floor plate still functions fine. The second concern was dirt. When you detach a magazine from a rifle, you open the magazine well. You expose the feed lips, the follower, the entire internal mechanism to whatever environment surrounds you. And in the Pacific, that meant salt water, sand, and tropical rot. In Italy, that meant mud. In the Ardennes, ice. Every time a soldier seated or removed a detachable magazine, he created a brief but real window for contamination. The Garand's en bloc system closed that window almost entirely. The receiver, designed with what engineers called a sealed internal architecture, kept foreign matter away from the feeding mechanism. The clip and the rounds entered as a single unit, locked in, and the bolt closed behind them. There was no exposed magazine well, no dangling box, no protruding housing to snag on brush, catch on equipment, or fill with mud during a belly crawl across contested ground. The third concern was ergonomic, and this one rarely gets discussed. In the 1930s, American infantry doctrine was built around the prone position. A rifleman who could get flat, sight in, and shoot accurately under fire was worth 3 standing soldiers. Any protrusion below the receiver, any magazine extending downward from the action, complicated that drill. It raised the shooter's profile. It changed the balance of the weapon. Senior officers, many of whom had built their careers on the bolt-action Springfield and its internal magazine, viewed a protruding box as an active impediment to the shooting position they had spent years perfecting. There was also a fourth factor, one that doesn't appear in official ordnance reports but ran through the thinking of the era nonetheless: the risk of accidents. With a detachable magazine, a soldier could remove the box and believe the weapon was unloaded, while a round still sat in the chamber. The en bloc system unloaded differently. When the clip was released, the action opened first, clearing the chamber before the rounds departed. It was, in its own way, a safety feature built into the architecture of the weapon. And then there was logistics. War is a supply chain. Generals win battles, but quartermasters win wars. And the men running America's Quartermaster Corps in the late 1930s understood something that gets lost in the romance of small arms. Everything that goes to the front must first be manufactured, inspected, packed, shipped, and distributed across thousands of miles of contested ocean. Complexity is the enemy of supply. The en bloc clip was an engineering triumph of simplicity. It was stamped from a single piece of spring steel in approximately 5 operations. It required no machining, no complex tolerances, no interchangeability testing between individual rifles. You filled it with 8 rounds of 30-06, packed it in a bandolier, and sent it forward. A soldier could carry 5 bandoliers, 8 clips each, across his chest. 40 rounds in a compact, lightweight system that took up far less space per round than any detachable magazine arrangement. A detachable box magazine was a different proposition entirely. It required precise dimensional tolerances to feed reliably. It had to seat correctly against the feed ramp of each individual rifle. In the 1940s, mass production was still working through the metallurgical and machining challenges of large-scale magazine manufacturing. Even the SCG-44, the German assault rifle that pioneered stamped construction and changed infantry weapons forever, had documented problems with magazine reliability. Not every magazine worked reliably with every rifle. Scale that problem up to 4 million Garand rifles in the hands of 18 million men under arms, spread across 3 continents in every conceivable climate, and the calculus shifts dramatically. A feeding failure in a detachable magazine system meant a lost rifle. 8 rounds of en bloc reliability scaled across the entire American Army meant something different, a supply chain that actually worked. This didn't mean the Army wasn't watching. By 1942, with combat experience pouring in from the Pacific and North Africa, the Ordnance Department's Technical Committee was already discussing what a next-generation Garand might look like. The answer came in the fall of 1944. Under John Garand's own direction, Springfield Armory began constructing the first prototype of a rifle designated the T-20. It was a Garand, fundamentally, same receiver, same gas operation, same rotating bolt, but modified to accept a 20-round detachable box magazine from the BAR and capable of selective fire, both semi-automatic and fully automatic. The engineering challenges were immediate. A column of 20 rounds is heavy. When stacked vertically, the cartridges don't rise fast enough to meet the bolt on an M1 length receiver. Garand's solution was to lengthen the receiver by roughly 1/3 of an inch, giving the magazine spring more time to push the next round into position. The first T-20 was completed and proofed at Springfield Armory in October 1944. By the following summer, the T-20E2, a refined version with grenade launching capability and scope mounting provisions, was considered by the Ordnance Technical Committee for limited procurement. An order for 100,000 rifles was actually recommended. Then, on August 6, 1945, a single bomb fell on Hiroshima. 9 days later, Japan surrendered. The T-20 program lost its urgency overnight. The rifles sat in inventory at Springfield Armory, studied, tested, and eventually forming part of the foundation for what would come later. It took another decade, and a new cartridge, and a new doctrine, and a Cold War that demanded interoperability with NATO allies. But the logic of the T-20 eventually won. In 1957, the United States Army officially adopted the M14 rifle, 20-round detachable box magazine, selective fire, built on the bones of a design that M1 Garand himself had sketched in 1944, knowing that his 8-round clip, however well it served, was not the final word. Here's what the critics of the en-bloc clip have always missed. The M1 Garand was not a compromise. It was not a concession. It was a rifle perfectly optimized for the constraints of its era. The metallurgical capabilities of 1936, the logistical realities of global war, the tactical doctrine of an army that had not yet fought the kind of fluid, fast-moving infantry battles that would define Korea and Vietnam. Every decision made about its feed system, the sealed receiver, the 8-round capacity, the stamped steel clip, was made by men who understood those constraints deeply, who had watched weapons fail in mud and snow and salt water, and who chose reliability over theoretical firepower. General George S. Patton understood this. On January 26, 1945, writing from his 3rd Army headquarters on official letterhead to Major General Levin Campbell, the War Department's Chief of Ordnance, Patton began his letter with a single, unambiguous declaration. In his opinion, the M1 rifle was the greatest battle implement ever devised, not despite its 8 rounds, not in spite of its en-bloc clip, with full knowledge of what it was and what it could do, in the hands of what he called, in that same letter, his unconquerable veterans. More than 4 million M1 Garands were built during World War II. They landed on beaches, fought through jungles, crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and froze in forests. They were carried by men who became the last line between civilization and catastrophe, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, they worked. Not despite the decisions made in Washington and Springfield in the 1930s. Because of them. The ping of an ejecting clip is not the sound of a limitation. It is the sound of a decision, made by engineers and soldiers and bureaucrats who understood that in war, the enemy isn't just the man in front of you. It's the mud. It's the cold. It's the supply chain that breaks down 1,000 miles from the front. It's the rifle that jams when your life depends on it, not jamming. M1 Garand built a weapon for that war. Not the war that came after, not the war in the imagination of tacticians writing doctrine in peacetime offices. The war that actually happened, in the Philippines and Guadalcanal, in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, across the frozen wastes of North Korea. In that war, 8 rounds was enough. It was enough at Iwo Jima. It was enough at the Bulge. It was enough in the hands of an 18-year-old from Kansas who had never fired a weapon before he was handed one and told to hold a line. The men who carried the Garand didn't complain about the clip. They came home. If this story matters to you, subscribe. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the Garand. And if you know a veteran who carried one, share this video with them. They earn the right to hear their story told. Right.